Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best. Here on Telesur. Mexican film and theater has firmly established itself on the world stage in recent years. The intense creativity and wide diversity of styles and subjects makes it impossible to sum up the contribution of Mexico and Mexicans to the world theater. But maybe what you can say is that the gritty realities we face here and the capacity of the human spirit to transcend them has brought forth amazing works with universal appeal. To talk about theater and film in Mexico, we're very pleased to have with us today Baltimore Beltrán. Baltimore is an actor, a playwright, and a stage director, and he starred in more than 20 productions in theater and many more than that in cinematic productions. Baltimore, thank you so much for being with us today. To start, I wanted to ask you about one of the recent films you've done called Mente Revolver, or Revolver Mind. And this film is fascinating, the premise of the film, because it's the story of perhaps Mexico's most famous murderer, convicted murderer, Mario Aburto, who in the film gets out of prison and has to begin his life over again. Of course, he is the assassin in one of the most famous cases here, which was the assassination of the presidential candidate Luis Donaldo Colosio. How were you attracted to this story in particular?
Well, first of all, I think that the assassination of Luis Donaldo Colosio marked my generation. And I was reflecting with my friend Alejandro Ramirez Corona, who is the director and screenwriter of the film. We've known each other since we were teenagers, so we've shared a period of life, and we went through that experience together.
We're talking about 1994, to set the stage for international viewers.
And, well, for me, that bullet detonated a wave of violence. And it was the first shot that, until that date, since the Mexican Revolution, there has been peace in Mexico, more or less. I mean, there were some very tragic moments, like in 1958 with the railroad workers, or 1968 with the students. But even after the fraud of '88, in 1988, the violence somehow was controlled. It didn't reach the levels that it could have reached, you know, even though there was a lot of violence. And after this assassination, there was a social decomposition in Mexico that followed shortly afterwards. So for me, it represents a watershed. Then, we Mexicans found out that the struggle for power had some very violent characteristics. And interestingly, that was when free market policies, the neoliberal politics, were introduced. So it's like the welcoming of the neoliberal system to the country. After that moment, the whole process started, the process that's about to end, let's say, in terms of privatization and all the neoliberal economic policies we've lived through, and all of the social decomposition that was a consequence of that. So, first of all, it was a watershed. And second, it was like the perfect crime, because to this day, we still don't know what happened, and it seems like it will remain shrouded in mystery, and we won't ever find out exactly what happened.
Well, let's explain just briefly to the audience. So there's a convicted killer in prison, but there's a broad sense, almost a consensus in Mexico, that the crime is not resolved because this person, there are masterminds, political masterminds in most of the hypotheses that exist behind this crime that lead on up to the upper echelons of power in Mexico. And there's extreme frustration, I think, in many ways, that we may never know the real truth about what happened that day, despite the fact that it changed the course of history for the country.
It's frustrating because for me, Mario Aburto, the character in Revolver Mind, represents the frustration of a citizen who experiences powerlessness with regard to his social, historical, and political reality. I mean, for many years, we were sold the idea of democracy, that we could really participate in government through voting. But after 6 years, we still didn't feel like the politicians took us into account, any of them. And it felt like there was no way for us to change it, much less contain it. So, of course, Mario Aburto is still in jail. Revolver Mind is playing with that. And we investigated a little about Mario's mentality, who he was. He was a man who lived in Michoacan with his family. He came from a poor campesino family. He went to Tijuana hoping to cross to the other side, but he didn't make it, so he ended up working in the maquiladoras. And we investigated this. The maquiladoras are a place where human rights don't exist.
So this is all the true part of Mario Aburto's biography.
Exactly. And, well, we kept investigating. And we found out that this character was overwhelmed by a sense of powerlessness. I identified with him, and I think that the audience can identify with him. I've felt that sense of powerlessness myself, facing this reality, facing the hollowing out of human rights, facing a lot of decisions made by politicians that seem completely against the interests of the majority and against human rights. So, well, secondly, it was interesting to ask the question in human terms, because the story is based on figures, on dates, numbers. But what happens behind all of that? So I do think that there are many victims of this economic system that's imposed on people. We can see that, for example, the hate that can be generated by living in circumstances of absolute and extreme misery, along with a violent environment, along with the drug market that affects people directly. And it will be pretty hard for them to develop feelings of empathy with other human beings, right? There's the worst symptom, I think, is the desire for revenge. When there's a lack of justice, in many cases, or rather, when people need justice, but when it's not available, the desire for justice ends up getting distorted into a desire for revenge, right? And I can see it today. I've seen it. Mexico is living through a stage of polarization, and it's very easy to polarize us. I mean...
That's what's interesting about the movie, too, that it's looking really at two different moments of the violence. If the violence really began, or began to be evident, because there was always violence in the system, you know, but began to take over in some ways and affect society in a bigger way with the assassination of Luis Donaldo Colosio. Then we see Mario Aburto leave prison and go out into a society that's even more violent, Tijuana of the current day, you know, with the drug war context and everything that's happened. So there's an interesting reflection on that progression during the time he's in prison as well.
That's a reflection the film is trying to provoke, because Mario Aburto gets out, and what he finds, he gets out at a moment when there is a presidential campaign. And he's confused, because the reality that he left still exists. The candidate is the same, the party is the same, the words the politicians say are the same, even though the politicians are different. They speak the same, they make the same promises. In the film Revolver Mind, Mario gets confused. For him, it's like going back to 1994. And of course, the reality he finds is much more violent, because now there's a hitman who's following him around to kill him. And it's sad when we find out that it's a kid who wants to be a musician, but doesn't have a job, who found a job as a police officer. And because he was a good police officer, organized crime forces him to join them. I mean, they force him. And so we see this kid's life, which is a very sad story, and it's inspired by true events. We can see it. So he doesn't just find the same reality, but an even more broken version of it. For the character of Mario in Revolver Mind, it just confuses him more and more, and he doesn't know what's going on. And furthermore, it's a world he can't live in anymore.
That's fascinating. We recently found out that you've been nominated for Best Actor for this role. Congratulations.
Thanks a lot.
How did you prepare for it? You mentioned that you did a lot of research about the past of Mario Aburto, his real life trajectory and biographical data. How did you prepare for it emotionally? How did you prepare for it to really get into the character?
There was a lot of journalistic investigation. We looked in the news archives for all the information we could find about Mario specifically, and also some documents that the prosecutor has made public. There are a lot of classified documents, and there are a lot of stories that people tell. There is a very interesting journalist named J.J. Lemus who wrote a book called Los Malditos, The Bad Guys, that tells stories. He was in prison, falsely accused of drug trafficking, and he was locked up in Puente Grande prison. That gave him the opportunity to meet the rock stars of crime. And he says that he survived thanks to journalism. Because when he started to find out who the people he was in prison with were, he started to interview them. And yes, it's a great book, all the stories he tells. He met and got to know Mario Aburto, and he tells some truly fascinating stories. There's one that I love, which is that one Christmas day, a prisoner started singing Christmas carols. And all of the prisoners were really happy, really enthusiastic. So the guards came to shut them up, very violently, and they started to beat up the guy who was singing. The prisoners got mad, and they started rioting. They started burning mattresses, clothes, everything. And then, when Mario Aburto realized what was happening and how dangerous it was, he yelled like, if you shut up and calm down, I'll tell you the true story about how I killed Colosio. Silence. And the guy who killed Ruiz Maceu said, are you really going to tell the truth?
Oh.
Because they were there together.
Because that was another murder, the other famous murder that made everyone suddenly feel like, what's going on here? Like something really major was happening in Mexican history at the time.
Exactly.
And the other one that's never really been solved either.
Right.
So here they're promising the true story to them, and suddenly became more interesting than Christmas carols.
That's right. And then he tells his side of the story. And I believe J.J. Lemus' version. And what I found was a character who's very confused.
Is that really the only place where he actually, where there's a version, his own version, full version of the events?
Yes.
Huh.
And he tells his side of the story. And I see someone who's very confused, who maybe is already going through a lot of pain. And it's sad because, well, I reflected on it. What is that pain a result of? Being locked up? Being tortured? What have they done to this person? He's someone this system used, and all the damage they've done to him. And finally, he represents, in a way, all the damage they've done to all of society. That's why this character is so interesting to me.
And is this the version that you use in the movie? We won't say what it is to avoid spoilers, but
exactly.
Is that the one that's portrayed in the movie as well? His version of things?
It doesn't specify. It doesn't really specify, although there are elements. When there are elements of his version, it doesn't... Well, I'll correct myself. It is Mario's version that we use in the film. It's his version there. And it's a confused version. I've listened to his father's voice. Seeing the relationship Mario has with his father, the creation of a false hope all the time, trying to find justice, and him always promising his father that it wasn't him, and the family, for 20 years, fighting for the truth, coming up against, well, you know, it's what a lot of Mexicans go up against. I mean, these days, there are a lot of people who are victims of a lot of different injustices. And they don't know where to put their pain, their desperation, and they have little hope of finding justice. In fact, not that long ago, Mario's parents delivered a letter to Andrés Manuel López Obrador after he became president, asking to have the case reviewed. So it's amazing. And it's really representative, at the end of the day, about what Mexican politics is, about the struggle for power, about people who can't buy justice. And... impunity. In that sense, this character represents many angles of our reality, of our immediate reality, of recent history, from '94 to this day.
So we have this movie looks deeply at violence, not just in the events that take place in the life of Mario Aburto, but as structural violence within the society that makes victims out of people as well. Another interesting series, a television series that you did that looks at tough social issues, is the series called Chronicles of Castes, or Crónicas de Castas, which deals with racism in Mexico City and differences in general, with the series of stories that take place in Tepito. Tell us about that one.
Well, it's a project directed by Daniel Jiménez Cacho, who is very interested in talking about racism in Mexico. The Chronicles of Caste are portraits that were made during the colonial era in Mexico that talked about the combinations of races. What happens between a mestizo and an indigenous person? It's called this. Between a black person and an indigenous person, it's called this. Like races of animals, there was that kind of classification. That's the Chronicles of Caste. From a Spaniard and an Indian comes a mestizo. And from a mestizo and a black person comes a patisambo. From a black person with a black person, you get something like that, like animals.
And then it had a series of like stereotypical traits that this interbreeding was supposed to result in?
Exactly. So that's why it's called that. And Daniel Jiménez Cacho really wanted to talk about that issue in present-day Mexico. And Tepito was the perfect context, because it's a neighborhood that, to this day, maintains its identity practically intact. It's a neighborhood that represents resistance. In that neighborhood, they found that Hernán Cortés captured Cuauhtémoc. Somehow he captured him, and a certain way, the defeat of the Aztec Empire culminated there, in the neighborhood of Tepito, on August 3rd, 1521. It's right next to a church. That's where they captured him. So since then, this neighborhood has characteristics of resistance or marginality and commerce. So we did a very thorough investigation. Jimena Gallardo wrote the script. Andres Solano was the producer, and we did it, and we made 9 episodes. After that, Adelheid Rosen, a Dutch theater director, came to tell us about a project she wanted to do with us here, and we did it. The project was called Safari in Tepito, and it was a theater action in the neighborhood, which was like the next step. 8 professional actors lived in Tepito for 8 days, with people from the neighborhood, so they could experience a little bit the daily experience. They discovered that they all had something in common. Even though they come from very different worlds, they discovered that they had things in common. Things like losing your parents, getting sick, life situations. And in that moment, when they discovered what they had in common, they developed a play. So there were 8 simultaneous plays, and 80 audience members came, split into 10 groups of 8, and they walked through the streets of Tepito. They went into the houses, they watched the plays, they ate, they traveled on motorcycle, they went into the barrios. And it was very interesting because they could articulate a network of solidarity. And one of the most interesting things we found, because we had to talk to everyone in the neighborhood of Tepito while the play was going on, it lasted 4 hours, we heard from the authorities that during those 4 hours, the violence decreased. So there were 4 hours of complete truce. There were no robberies, no murders, for the 4 hours that the project lasted in the neighborhood of Tepito.
That's amazing. And the moment when they discover these shared interests.
Yes, and at the end, the performance ended in a place, it's called the CETEPI, the Center for Tepito Studies. And all of the spectators, because there were people from all over, from Condesa, from Polanco, there were people from Miami, people came to enter the neighborhood. And at the end, the most exciting thing was that everyone had dinner at that place together, without labels, setting their prejudices to the side, discovering each other as people. And for me, as well as for Daniel Jiménez Cacho, and everyone who was part of the project, that's the basis of any peace process, of any process of reconstruction of the social fabric. It's that, discovering each other, looking past prejudice, and recognizing each other as human beings. It's the most basic thing. And I think
one of the things I forgot to mention when I was listing very briefly your many accomplishments and talents is that you're also an activist, and use your art, especially theater and film, to amplify voices against or issues that reveal the struggles for social justice within the community. What do you think the particular value of film is in social change?
Well, I think that art always offers reflection, introspection, reflection. I don't think that art should always say what the correct path is, because it's easy to split everything into the good guys and the bad guys. But it's always easy to identify yourself with the good guys or the bad guys, and that's it. Nothing else happens, right? I don't think that art should moralize or say what's good and what isn't, but it does help us reflect as people, to be able to have a dialogue with ourselves, with others, about what we are suffering from, what we are living. And that's why activist work is important to me.
Thanks so much for being with us, and I hope we get a chance to talk again soon. And best of luck with everything, and congratulations.
Thanks so much. Thanks to the whole team at Telesur, and I hope to be back soon.
And thank you for joining us. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.